Welcome to the J.D. Levy and Associates Calibration Point Podcast. Our podcasts are designed to bring a conversational exploration of key topics that we believe will provide value and insight to those serving in the nonprofit sector. We will highlight new developments in the field, latest research, and things we're learning from our own clients that we can share.
I want to welcome everybody to this month's Calibration Point Podcast. And this month, I'm taking a little bit different approach. I have been asked a couple different times to share some learnings that I have had with the podcast audience. And this comes from a literature review of a lot of different research I have done over the past couple of years and used it to guide and help some organizations that are in some cohort-based training programs that we've designed and facilitate. The focus of the research that I did was I had spent quite a bit of time looking at a lot of different studies, evaluations on highly successful nonprofit organizations and looking at what they were identifying in all of these different studies as the keys, or not even the keys, the characteristics that those organizations had as it related to strong organizational culture and long-term success. The studies that I looked at were a little different than some of the ones like that Jim Collins would have done in his study Good to Great or Forces for Good. Those were looking at more holistic perspectives of even financials and fundraising, etc. The ones that I was focused on were really were looking more specifically at organizational culture and practices that those organizations were utilizing that were creating highly successful organizations. So in my approach, I read through and researched all these various studies and started taking note of those characteristics that existed across the studies that were common to see if there was any connection, if there was a trend, if there were items or elements that existed in all these various studies. And it turns out that there were 7 key characteristics or critical characteristics of organizational success that existed in all of the studies in some direct form. So I pieced those out and identified those 7, and I have been teaching on those 7 for a while now, as far as the 7 common characteristics of successful organizations that I found in doing this literature review, this evaluation of the various researches out there. And so I was asked to consider putting that into a simple podcast. And so this month, the topic I'm going to use is a quick evaluation of those 7 so that we can all be calibrated, hence calibration point, on the findings that I had as I was getting to review the various research that was out there. The first characteristic that existed in all of these assessments or studies in literature that I reviewed was that the most successful or the successful organizations had a ability to foster a learning culture. So that was number 1. What does that mean? Well, the way that was described in the research that I saw was a learning culture was one that focused on and even incentivized individuals within the organization to continually reach beyond themselves, to learn, to be sense makers in their realm, whatever that is, whatever the role was. They had almost an intense focus on catalyzing a culture that sought to continually learn. I guess on the individual level, we use the term become lifelong learners. I would say you could say from what I gathered, those organizations had built a culture of lifelong learning. The second characteristic that existed in all these organizations, and in all the research, at least, of these organizations that existed, were that those organizations that were highly successful, and it's a common element in those studies, was that those organizations intentionally created systems to transfer knowledge and to bridge organizational memory. What that meant was that they ensured that they weren't losing perspectives from the past, by positive or negative, in ensuring that the organization, as it continued to evolve, had a constant clarity of understanding of the narrative of the past of the organization, and made sure that that was then being transferred into the future growth of the organization. And they also did the same thing, or had a similar focus on transferring knowledge in general. Why we take approaches that we take, the philosophies of the organization, what this means in our culture, not just core values, but really looking holistically at what are those things that they had defined as important, and ensured that they had mechanisms to transfer that knowledge into the future of the organization, and that the past history of the organization had clarity in the future of why it was important and why it mattered. This becomes really important if you think about board culture, when we have board members that are transitioning out of roles and cohorts on a board that, we could get within a hypothetical 10-year or 15-year time period and have no board members who have been on the board past 10 years ago, 9 years ago, depending on how their cycles are, and lose a lot of great information. That's just one example. So the second characteristic that existed in all of these studies was that those highly successful organizations created systems to transfer knowledge and organizational memory into the future growth of the organization. The third characteristic that existed in those studies was that they had a very disciplined focus on developing leaders. What does that mean? First, we have to understand how they were defining leadership. And leaders was defined as individuals who were able to mobilize people outside of themselves, people who sought to help others reach their potential and sought to be a catalyst for the organization reaching its potential. And that they were able to mobilize team members, other parts of their organization, to really find their potential and to grow in creating significance within the organization. So that third characteristic, they had a disciplined focus on developing leaders. Number 4, the characteristic that existed in these studies was that those organizations that were highly successful had a focus on creating reflective, keyword reflective, planning environments. I guess we could say there's 2 words there. 1, they were planning. And number 2, how do we define planning? It was reflective planning. So they weren't just focused on what's coming at us. They were looking at where their strategies have been effective, what the outcomes of those strategies had been, and then what we do with that understanding as we define the next chapter of the organization's growth. And they created planning environments that were continually reflective on those. If we go back to the essence of the nonprofit sector being one of social experimentation, we have a hypothesis, we test that hypothesis, we reframe as we learn, and we redeploy and revise our hypothesis because we're driving social change and impact. These reflective planning environments are critical in that model of an organization. Number 5, one that should be core to all of us, was those organizations that were the most effective. The common characteristic in all these studies was that they took care of their team members. They understood what was going on with them. They sought to meet them where they were at. They sought to ensure that they were being cared for organizationally, or I should say by the organization, that those individuals were being taken care of. This may seem commonplace to a lot of you, but as we also know, there are a lot of organizations that get so busy doing that we forget to focus on taking care of the team that we have. The saying goes that we also have a lot of individuals in an organization that end up doing lots of things for the organization, but aren't focused on working on the organization. This taking care of the team ensures that we're focused on taking care of the team, that we're working on the organization. Number 6 was that they had a focus of making sure that the executive director's role was doable. This one is a big issue in the nonprofit space because so often the executive director's role really isn't doable. It's not realistic. And then we end up with a lot of the challenges that we have in executive director leadership due to the executive director's role really not being one that's doable. We do a lot of recruitment at times for organizations, and one of the challenges we often have is doing succession work with an executive director. An organization comes to the realization that we're not looking for one person to truly replace the ED and the kind of sacrifice that person was making. They're actually going to have to go to market for 2. That's not a sustainable place for an organization to be. So number 6 of the 7 characteristics that existed in all these studies was that the executive director's role was doable. And number 7, these organizations, one of the characteristics that existed across the studies was that they knew how to manage in the emergency loss of a senior leader, especially the executive director or the CEO of the organization. This is different than having an emergency succession plan. What this research was indicating was that they understood what the consequence would look like in the emergency loss of a senior leader. And they were able to and spent time focused on how do we manage relational dynamics? How do we manage internal team dynamics? How do we manage with the board? How do we understand at any given time what things are in momentum in our organization because of a certain leader? One of the ways that they understood that goes back to our earlier one. They had systems to transfer knowledge. They also focused on reflective planning environments. Hopefully you're seeing that these 7 characteristics, there's a reason that there were other things in these studies, but these are the 7 that existed in all of them, that they truly are interdependent on one another. When you start to develop one, you naturally start to develop another. So point number 7 was that they knew how to manage in the emergency loss of the executive director or a significant, meaning a senior level position in the organization. Not saying that they didn't understand that for mid-level and frontline team members. They very well may have. Point of the research, the characteristic that showed up in all the studies was the senior leadership team or the executive director. So there you have it. Foster a learning culture, create systems to transfer knowledge and organizational memory, develop leaders, create a reflective planning environment, take care of your team, ensure the executive director's role is doable, and be sure that we know how to manage and navigate the dynamics of our organization in the emergency loss of a senior leader within our organization, especially the executive director or the CEO. These 7 characteristics showed up in all the various studies that I reviewed on understanding and looking at this most successful organizations and how to build strong organizations. These topics are great if you want to use them in a board meeting, if you want to use them with a team. You could literally take 1 or 2 of these and ask, what does this mean to us? And have we thought about this? I hope you find this beneficial. It's good planning tools just to have these 7 and use them as part of a reflective planning environment. Point number 4, hopefully now you've got more knowledge and more food for the table in a sense as you begin to build your own organizations. Until next time, signing off.
Thanks for listening to the J.D. Levy & Associates Calibration Point Podcast. If you have comments or ideas for future episodes, please reach out using the contact page on our website, jdlevyassociates.com.